Imagine this. You're driving down the highway. Up ahead, a car is pulled over on the shoulder, hazards blinking. As you slow down to pass, you notice the bumper stickers. A candidate you can't stand, a flag or slogan for the other side. Maybe a hat or a shirt that tells you exactly where this person stands. And it's the opposite of where you stand. Your gut reaction? Not my problem. Let one of their people help them. And then that little voice kicks in. The one that went to Catholic school or grew up hearing Bible stories. Didn't Jesus tell you to help people like this? The Good Samaritan? You're supposed to stop. You're supposed to help everyone, no matter who they voted for. So is that it? Is the moral of the Good Samaritan just grit your teeth and help people you politically despise? If that's genuinely all this story means, it's pretty thin, forgettable lesson. But if you actually understand who the Samaritan was to the people Jesus was talking to, you'll realize the story isn't asking you to merely tolerate your political enemy on the other side of the road. It's asking something far more radical, far more uncomfortable, and far more relevant to the way you actually live. To get there, you have to go back, past the moral of the story version we got in Sunday school, into 1st century Judea, into centuries-old ethnic and religious feud that Jesus' original audience knew intimately. The parable appears in Luke 10 verse 25 through 37. A scholar asks the law of Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answers with the story. But to feel the force of that answer, you need to know who a Samaritan was to a 1st century Jew. Samaria was the region between Judea and Galilee. Centuries earlier, after the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC, many Israelites were deported, and foreign peoples were resettled in the land. Over time, the population that remained intermarried with these foreign settlers, and their religious practice blended Israelite worship of God with other regional influences. The Samaritans accepted only the Torah, the first 5 books of Scripture, and built their own temple on Mount Gerizim, rejecting Jerusalem as a true place of worship. To Jews of Jesus' day, this made Samaritans not only foreigners, but worse, a corrupted, heretical offshoot of their own people. This wasn't simple distant prejudice. It was live, bitter, generational feud. Samaritans had at one point defiled the Jerusalem temple during Passover by scattering human bones in it. Jews traveling between Galilee and Judea would often go miles out of their way, crossing the Jordan and back, just to avoid setting foot in Samaritan territory. John's Gospel sums it up plainly when the Samaritan woman at the well, surprised Jesus even speaks to her, quoting, "For Jews use nothing in common with Samaritans," John 4:9. So when a devout Jewish scholar of the law asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" the honest, unspoken assumption was, not them. Neighbor meant fellow Jew, certainly not a Samaritan. Think of it less like a stranger, and more like the group whose politics, whose values, whose entire way of life you consider not just wrong, but a betrayal of everything sacred to you. It's worth sitting with why this hostility ran so deep, because it wasn't just tribalism for its own sake. It was, in the Jewish mind, a matter of covenant fidelity. The law of Moses repeatedly warned Israel against mixing worship of the true God with the practices of surrounding nations. The Samaritans, in Jewish eyes, represented exactly that danger realized. People who claimed the heritage of Israel, but had compromised the purity of worship. Wrong temple, wrong text, intermarried lineage. For a devout Jew, avoiding Samaritans wasn't experienced as bigotry for its own sake. It was experienced as faithfulness, guarding the boundaries of the community, guarding right worship, guarding what they believed was sacred. It's not unlike how many people today feel about political or ideological opponents. Not, "I just dislike them," but what they stand for is genuinely dangerous, and associating with it feels like betraying what I believe in. That's exactly why the priest and the Levite in the parable step around the wounded man. Contact with a corpse-like or bloodied body could render a priest ritually unclean, disqualifying him from temple service. Their choice to pass by wasn't random callousness. In their own minds, it may have even looked like religious responsibility. Jesus is setting up a situation where the correct, principled people fail to act, and the person who does act is the one everyone listening had already written off as the enemy. Here's the scene. A man is beaten, stripped, and left for dead on the Jericho road. Priest sees him and passes by. A Levite, temple assistant, does the same. Then a Samaritan comes along, sees him, and is moved with compassion. He bandages his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, puts the man on his own animal, brings him to an inn, pays for his care out of pocket, and promises to cover whatever more it costs. Then Jesus asks the lawyer the piercing question, and notice, he doesn't ask who was the wounded man's neighbor. He asks, which of these 3, in your opinion, was the neighbor to the robber's victim? The scholar can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. He just says, the one who treated him with mercy. This this is the reversal. Jesus isn't merely telling his audience, go help people outside your group. He is dismantling the category itself. The lawyer wanted to know the boundary of neighbor obligation. Who counts? Who doesn't? Where can I stop caring? Jesus refuses to answer that question on its own terms. Instead, he makes the despised outsider, the political and religious enemy, the moral hero of the story, and the pious insiders, the ones who fail. The lesson isn't tolerate people you disagree with when they're in trouble. The lesson is the neighbor is not defined by tribe, ideology, or which side of the line they stand on. Mercy itself defines who is a neighbor, and you are called to become that kind of neighbor to whoever crosses your path in need, regardless of what they believe. This is where the Catechism of the Catholic Church picks the story up. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1825, discussing charity, the Church cites this parable directly. Christ died for us, while we were still enemies. Love of neighbor is inseparable from love of God. In that neighbor, the Catechism says, quoting the Second Vatican Council's Gaudium et Spes, is every person without exception, even if he is not a friend but a stranger, even an enemy. The parable is cited as the model for what mercy actually looks like in action. Not sentiment, not political agreement, but a concrete, costly response. Seeing suffering, being moved and acting, bandaging, carrying, paying, regardless of the wounded man's politics or pedigree. The Catechism also frames this parable in its teaching on the fifth commandment and virtue of charity, and Pope Francis leaned on it heavily in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, devoting an entire chapter to it, reading the wounded traveler as anyone abandoned on the roadside of society, and the Samaritan as the model for how we're called to rebuild human fraternity across every line that divides us, political lines very much included. So the importance of the story isn't a commandment to suddenly agree with your ideological opposite or pretend the disagreements don't matter. It's about the posture of the heart. Jesus is asking, will your love stop at the borders of your political tribe, your sense of who's on the right side, who deserves it, or will it look like the Samaritans? Active, costly, and utterly indifferent to which side of the aisle the person in front of you sits on. So let's go back to that car pulled over on the highway. Hazards on, bumper stickers screaming everything you're against. What does Catholic teaching actually ask of you here? It's not asking you to change your convictions, pretend to agree with them, or stay silent if the moment calls for an honest conversation later. Prudence still matters. Catholic moral theology always held charity and prudence together, not in tension. But it is asking you to notice the moment you catch yourself thinking, let someone from their side deal with it, because that thought is the exact posture of the priest and the Levite, deciding this person falls outside the boundary of who they owe anything to. Mercy here looks concrete, pulling over, asking if they're okay, calling for a tow, offering water, waiting for them if it's safe, not because you've suddenly adopted their politics, but because their humanity was never actually up for a vote. The Samaritan didn't stop to check the wounded man's theology before bandaging his wounds. He saw a person in need and acted. The deeper question Jesus is putting to you goes beyond the highway shoulder though. Who have you already decided doesn't count as your neighbor because of how they vote, what they post, what team they're on? The Samaritan was the person the lawyer couldn't even say out loud. Jesus is asking you to find your Samaritan, the group, the person, the label you'd expect mercy to come from or go to, and close that gap with actual concrete love, even while the disagreements remain entirely real. That's Catholic love of neighbor. Not agreement, not merely civility from a distance, but caritas, willing and working the good of the other, especially when it costs you something, especially when they're on the other side. Before you go, I want you to actually do something with this, not just nod along and move on. Think of one specific person right now, not a category, not people like that, an actual person, a family member you've gone quiet with, a coworker whose yard sign made you roll your eyes, someone in your group chat you've quietly muted. Picture their face. That's your Samaritan moment, not some hypothetical stranger on a hypothetical road, them specifically. And I'm not saying you have to agree with them, invite them to dinner, or pretend the tension isn't real. Jesus didn't ask the Samaritan to become Jewish, and he didn't ask the lawyer to suddenly love the Samaritan theology. He asked for mercy in the moment mercy was needed. That's a much smaller, much more doable thing than fix the whole relationship. It might just be not piling on when someone else mocks them, or refusing to laugh at the joke that reduces them to a stereotype. Because here's the uncomfortable truth the parable leaves us with. The priest and the Levite probably went home that day and still thought of themselves as good, faithful men. They had reasons, they always do. The question the story keeps asking across 2,000 years isn't, Were their reasons understandable? It's who did they walk past? So don't let this be a video where you watched and agreed with. Let it be the video where you actually picked the person. So next time someone reduces the Good Samaritan to be nice to people you disagree with, you can say, it's not quite that. And also, so much more than that. It's not a rule about political tolerance. It's a call to tear down the invisible walls we build around who deserves our compassion. Walls of ideology, party, tribe, grievance, and to become ourselves a neighbor. Someone whose love isn't rationed out based on who the person votes for, but poured out wisely and courageously because of who we are called to be in Christ. Go and do likewise. If this helped you see this parable in a new light, please let me know. And if you want to see more videos digging into the historical and theological context behind familiar Bible stories, then subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. God bless.